The toll at Ballykelly, 16 dead, 70 injured. The soldiers thought it was a safe place for an evening out.
Next week marks the 40th anniversary of the Droppin pub bombing in Ballykelly, an attack which killed 17 people. The INLA said it carried out the bombing on the 6th of December 1982 that claimed the lives of 6 civilians and 11 soldiers. Tony Gauvain is a former Lieutenant Colonel of the Cheshire Regiment. He told our reporter Teresa Craig that he knew all of the soldiers who were killed that evening.
When we heard this loud bang, as a result of which I leapt out of bed and leapt into my clothes and got myself down to drive towards the camp. Obviously came across the scene at the drop-in well, which was completely demolished and a cloud of smoke and a lot of people rushing around in a high state of alarm and despondency.
Can you remember, Tony, what it was like, how people were responding, what you saw?
Obviously there were flames and smoke, and there were people staggering around, other people helping people staggering around. The emergency services were doing their job, which was brilliant. And I can remember the arrival of cranes to lift the debris of the building up in order to release the bodies.
You, of course, were a commanding officer with the Cheshire Regiment.
Yeah.
Your first thoughts must have turned to colleagues that may be dead or injured.
Well, when you're faced with a situation like that, there's a multitude of thoughts that go through your mind. I mean, I knew most of all the soldiers who were involved. I think there were 8 soldiers who were killed. One was, as a commanding officer, one had to let the people whose job it is to deal with these things to get on with it. I was a rather shocked and helpless bystander, and at some point later on, I made myself go to our operations room in the camp in order to handle the inevitable phone calls and radio calls and messages and all the rest of it.
You would have known so many of those who died and who were also injured, and also the impact and the aftermath on survivors.
Yes, I mean, I knew them, some of them very well. And the key point about the aftermath that I remember was the need to control our reactions and handling of the event. The aftermath, especially in the days to follow, needed, in my opinion, at the time, careful handling. And I was very proud of the fact that the soldiers in the battalion maintained their professionalism and their dignity and control and did not allow any form of retaliation or revenge to be expressed, which was always a slight concern I had for obvious reasons.
And given the times that you were serving in, an atrocity like the Droppin bombing in such a small village like Ballykelly, at the back of your mind, was it always something that you were worried about, that you feared might happen?
Yeah, there was a constant threat that whichever faction of the opposition, shall we put it that way, might try and do something. There were measures in place to gauge the level of alertness that there should be at any one time. The camp in itself in Ballykelly is fairly remote and so on and so forth. There was always a desire to enable and allow the soldiers to walk out use the pub or the restaurant to go out and to live a bit of a normal life, as and when the security situation was judged to allow that to happen without recrimination or anything. Clearly, the opposition at that time succeeded in getting through, put it that way. That will obviously always remain a regret, to put it mildly.
And when you talk about opposition, the INLA said it was responsible. Did you feel any anger?
Yes, I still do. You press the right buttons with any of us, we could easily go into paroxysms of rage and disgust. Still apparent. You pressed my right button now, and I'll wax lyrical about the appalling mentality of these such people.
How do you deal with it then? You talk about rage, you talk about anger. So how do you deal with it then 4 decades on?
Well, because we get older, don't we? We learn to control ourselves. And as I say, I've mentioned pressing the button. I mean, that's a euphemism, as a metaphor for thinking, allowing thoughts to be triggered. I mean, I've become a psychotherapist since then, so I'm a bit aware of all this stuff that goes on in the head and the heart. I've learned now, retrospectively, that it is possible to control one's emotions.
Given your later career then as a psychotherapist and living and working during the Troubles in a different capacity, did you then understand the psyche of the opposition as you describe them, given those very tumultuous political times?
Yes, one was aware, obviously, of the history of the whole area, and before going on these operations, one is a point of professionalism is to learn about the history of what one's doing. So, I'm perfectly well aware of the existence of oppositions and their capacity for apply their own attempts to further their aims. Nevertheless, even in war, there are limits to hostile action.
Would you ever meet with those who are responsible?
The short answer is probably no, because I can't, frankly, at 40 years on, what would be the point of the meeting? They're not going to lie down and say sorry, so I don't want to necessarily need to create a meeting in which they can revive their vilification of whatever they think of the matter. There wouldn't be much point in a meeting.
Well, that was Tony Gauvain, former Lieutenant Colonel in the Cheshire Regiment, now a psychotherapist, telling our colleague Teresa Craig about the trauma that he and his fellow soldiers experienced in the Droppin pub bombing in Ballykelly 4 decades ago.